Well, thank you very much for coming. I'm delighted. I wonder whether I can talk around the subject of my book in the first instance, because the book is written in a very circular fashion. So this talk had better reflect the book. I very much endorse the whole, as it were, mission of radical independent bookshops. And let me start with radical independent bookshops in Iran. After the revolution, when the Shah was overthrown, before the triumph of the conservative clerical faction, 250 independent political and literary titles were published. It was almost like a Tehran spring as everybody began to express themselves for the first time. They thought freely, and of course they hoped that this freedom would last. And as well as the publication of books came the recording of, they were still on cassettes in those days, the unleashing of a very great deal of creative and experimental music, and all of this, and the publishing houses and the recording studios that allowed all of this to happen, were casualties when the Tehran spring came to an end, with the triumph of the clerical faction. Now I'm starting like this because of course what's in the news right now is what's happening on the streets of Tehran and other parts of Iran, and I've got one of my own former students who's sending me daily reports from the demonstrations where she's attending. At the same time, you have a number of people who have been long, as it were, involved in opposition to Ahmadinejad's version of the Iranian Revolution. And they also are coming out onto the streets, and I've been in communication with these people for a very long time as well. Let me start with that term, Ahmadinejad's faction of the clerical faction, because there's more to it than meets the eye, of course. What you've got on the streets right now has got nothing to do with free democratic choice in the way that we would normally expect it. You've got a number of candidates who are allowed to stand by the ruling theocratic institutions, and all of them were in one way or another closely associated with the original triumph of the clerical faction that basically hijacked the revolution that overthrew the Shah. Some are more reformist than others, and certainly I think the young people of Iran in particular would like to see the more reformist people in power. At the same time, they are very much as you would expect in the kinds of politics we've come to expect here in Western Europe, something like a variation between centre-right and centre-left. Who's really going to notice too much in the transition of government of that sort except different stylistics? What is at stake here in Iran is a great political game which is hugely misunderstood by the West, in which faction competes against faction, and the differences between different factions are often minuscule, sometimes very great, but if they became greater than a certain extent, they wouldn't be allowed to exist in proximity to the government and to the ruling ayatollahs. Don't forget that Musavi, the so-called defeated moderate reformist candidate, was a very close friend, a very close associate of Ayatollah Khomeini at the beginning of the revolution. Don't forget also, let's trace some genealogies back here. Khomeini didn't come back to Iran simply with a theocratic mission. When he was in exile in Paris, he came into contact with a great number of Palestinian activists and Palestinian exiles, and was heavily, as it were, persuaded by their arguments based on the work of writers with whom we are familiar, people like Frantz Fanon, and the whole idea of overcoming a world that was full of dependency on the institutions and the hegemonies of the West. So underneath all of the religious and theocratic rhetoric, there are points of identification and commonality with what we in the West would normally suppose to be a leftist agenda. So that even we, who I think most of us would identify ourselves as one stripe or another of left, would fail to understand the lefts of other cultures and of other countries. Now that's my starting point. And of course, when you look around even a radical bookshop like this, we can have an interesting competition. How many titles would we find written by non-Western, non-European authors? And if we do find any, and I don't think you will, because I've had a good look around the bookshop, they would be available in this country in translation, which might or might not capture the nuances of what they were trying to argue. Even when we, on the left, try to formulate our responses to the globalized hegemonies of those who are in power and who dominate flows of capital and flows of exploitation here in the West, we do so from a particular standpoint. And we ourselves don't understand those people who are also resistors, or those people who would also wish to make a stand in other countries. One of the very interesting things is that the foundation philosopher of the Iranian Revolution, he spent some time in prison under the Shah. He died very shortly before the success of the revolution. But he was a young Iranian philosopher called Shariati. There's a whole chapter in the book on Shariati. And none of his writings is available in English. And so there was a real search, as it were, to uncover at least translations or fragments of his writing that had been made privately by other people. But nobody's actually put them together. There would be something like 30 volumes of his collected works, and nobody has bothered to translate them into English. So to all intents and purposes, he is an unknown figure here in the West, and certainly an unknown figure on the Western left. But what he was saying was actually a combination of a whole range of different influences. He was a doctoral student in Paris. He was a contemporary of both Camus and of Sartre. He was very deeply influenced by the existentialist movement in Paris in the 1950s. He was part of the whole post-World War II revival of France in that particular period, and greatly imbued by the wonders of what he thought was Western culture. We all know the Parisians do these things much better than the rest of us, so maybe he got a false picture about how cosmopolitan and sophisticated Western culture was meant to be, but he was beguiled. And the strange thing was that he was particularly beguiled by the organization, and wait for this, the capacity for modernization of the Catholic Church.